The platform was deserted except for the faint hum of a flickering overhead light. Rajesh shivered and tightened his coat against the biting wind. The train station, perched on the edge of a forgotten village, felt like a relic of another era. Paint peeled from weathered signs, and the ticket booth was boarded shut. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The Midnight Express would arrive any minute now. The station master had assured him. A distant whistle pierced the silence, and a dim light appeared in the fog. The train emerged like a phantom, its massive engine gleaming despite its antiquated design. Rajesh felt a twinge of unease as the train rolled to a stop with an unnatural smoothness. The air seemed heavier now, pressing against his chest. He climbed aboard, his shoes echoing on the metallic steps. Inside, the train was dimly lit, the lamps casting long, wavering shadows. The seats were upholstered in cracked leather, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, as if it hadn't been freshened in decades. Rajesh found a seat by the window and placed his briefcase beside him. He was alone in the compartment, save for an old man sitting at the far end. The man wore a black coat and hat, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't glance up when Rajesh entered, his focus fixed on something invisible through the frosted window. The train jerked forward. Rajesh looked outside, expecting to see the familiar countryside, but the landscape was obscured by a thick fog. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks filled the compartment, steady and hypnotic. He tried to relax, but unease gnawed at him. Something about this journey felt wrong. He pulled out his phone to distract himself, only to find there was no signal. Strange, he thought. Even in rural areas, he could usually manage a faint bar. The conductor appeared suddenly, stepping into the compartment with a quiet precision that startled Rajesh. He was a wiry man with hollow cheeks, dressed in a faded uniform that seemed too large for his thin frame. "Ticket, sir," the conductor said, his voice dry and raspy. Rajesh handed over his ticket, which the conductor inspected closely before punching it with a tool that looked as old as the train itself. "You're going to Chatgar?" the conductor asked without looking up. "Yes," Rajesh replied, noticing how the conductor avoided meeting his eyes. The conductor nodded, muttered something unintelligible, and moved to the next compartment. Rajesh exhaled, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. He glanced at the old man in the corner, who still hadn't moved. Maybe it was just the lateness of the hour or the eerie silence, but Rajesh couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At the next stop, the train slowed but didn't fully halt. Rajesh peered outside. The platform was empty, the station shrouded in darkness. As the train sped up again, he noticed a faint figure standing on the platform, staring directly at his window. The face was indistinct, but the figure's gaze burned into him. He turned back to the compartment and tried to convince himself it was his imagination. He pulled a book from his briefcase, determined to focus on something mundane. But the words swam on the page, refusing to coalesce into meaning. Minutes, or was it hours, passed. The train continued to glide through the fog, its rhythm steady but almost too perfect, as though it weren't really on tracks. The old man in the corner suddenly stood, his movements unervingly stiff. He walked past Rajesh without a word, the faint scent of decay trailing behind him. Rajesh's heart quickened. He stood and stepped into the aisle, following the old man into the next compartment. It was nearly identical to the one he had just left, save for one difference. The windows were completely black, as if they opened onto nothingness. The old man had disappeared. "Excuse me," Rajesh called, his voice shaking slightly. "Sir, are you all right?" Silence. He turned back toward his seat but froze. A figure stood at the far end of the compartment. A man in a long black coat, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. It wasn't the old man. "Is something wrong?" the man asked, his voice deep and measured. Rajesh hesitated, unsure how to answer. I was looking for someone. An older gentleman. He came through here just now." The man chuckled softly, a sound devoid of warmth. "You won't find him," he said. "Some people don't stay where you expect them to." Rajesh felt a chill creep up his spine. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the next carriage. Rajesh hesitated, but decided against following him. Something about the man's presence had felt inherently wrong, as though he were only half real. He returned to his seat and found his briefcase exactly where he'd left it. The train's rhythm seemed louder now, each click of the wheels on the tracks echoing like a heartbeat. Rajesh closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the image of the figure on the platform flashed through his mind. When he opened his eyes again, his reflection in the window startled him. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing behind him in the glass. He turned sharply, but the compartment was empty. The train sped on, its destination shrouded in fog, as Rajesh's unease solidified into fear. The train's steady rhythm began to falter. Rajesh noticed the change immediately, a faint stutter in the previously seamless click of the wheels. It was subtle at first, like a whisper on the edge of hearing, but soon the interruptions became jarring, throwing the train's movements off balance. He glanced at the window, expecting to see the misty countryside roll by, but was met instead with an oppressive blackness. It wasn't the natural darkness of night, but something deeper, suffocating, as though the train were plunging into an abyss. The faint, almost imperceptible whispering began again. Rajesh stiffened, his ears straining to pinpoint its source. The sound seemed to emanate from the very walls of the train, the murmurings layered and overlapping like the fragmented remnants of a dozen voices. "Hello," Rajesh called out, his voice hoarse. The whispering stopped abruptly, as though whatever had been speaking had heard him. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. Feeling exposed, Rajesh stood and moved cautiously toward the next compartment. As he slid the door open, the metallic screech of its hinges grated against his nerves. The carriage beyond was almost identical to the one he had left, but something was off, slightly wrong in ways he couldn't immediately identify. The seats looked older, the leather cracked and discolored, as though decades of wear had occurred in moments. The lamps flickered more frequently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. And the air, he noticed now, was heavier, tinged with a faint, acrid smell that burned his throat. At the far end of the carriage sat a man Rajesh hadn't seen before. He was tall and thin, dressed in an immaculate black suit. His hands rested neatly on a polished cane, and his head tilted slightly as if listening. "Excuse me," Rajesh said, stepping closer. "Do you know what's going on with this train? It doesn't seem to be—" The man raised a hand, cutting Rajesh off mid-sentence. His head turned slowly, revealing a face so pale it seemed translucent. His eyes were sunken and dark, but his lips curled into a polite smile. "You should sit down," the man said in a calm, measured voice. "It's safer that way." Rajesh hesitated, unsettled by the man's presence. Safer? From what? The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too perfect. "You'll see." Before Rajesh could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the compartment into momentary darkness. When they steadied again, the man was gone, his seat empty and pristine, as though he'd never been there at all. Rajesh's heart raced. He stumbled backward, his mind grappling for rational explanations. Perhaps he was dreaming, or maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But the growing knot of fear in his stomach told him otherwise. He turned and hurried back toward his original seat. But the next compartment he entered wasn't the one he remembered. The seats were completely empty, their cushions torn and gutted, and the windows were now boarded up from the outside, sealing him in. Desperation mounting, he shouted, "Is anyone there?" "Conductor! Someone!" The only response was the faint echo of his own voice. The whispering returned, louder this time, more distinct. Rajesh froze as he realized the voices weren't coming from the walls, but from the seats. The torn cushions seemed to writhe faintly, as though something inside them was struggling to escape. He backed away, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. As he stumbled, the whispering grew into a low, mournful wail. He turned and bolted, racing through the carriages, each more decayed than the last. One compartment had walls streaked with what looked like rust, though the smell suggested something far worse. Another was filled with shadowy figures seated upright, their faces obscured. As Rajesh passed, they turned their heads in unison, though their features remained indistinct like smudged charcoal sketches. Finally, Rajesh burst into a carriage that seemed different. It was cleaner and newer, with polished seats and bright lighting. For a moment, he felt a flicker of relief, and then he noticed the photographs. The walls were lined with framed pictures of people, each one staring directly into the camera. The faces were a mix of expressions, some serene, others contorted in terror, but all of them shared one unsettling feature. Their eyes seemed alive, as though they were watching him. At the end of the carriage stood the conductor, his gaunt frame casting an impossibly long shadow. He turned to face Rajesh, his hollow eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here," the conductor said, his voice carrying an edge of anger. Rajesh took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. "What is this place? What's happening?" The conductor ignored the question, stepping closer. His face began to shift, the flesh pulling taut over his skull, his features contorting into something inhuman. "This train," the conductor hissed, "is not for the living." The lights dimmed, plunging the carriage into shadow. When they flickered back, the conductor was gone, but the whispering had returned, louder than ever, now mixed with faint cries and sobs. Rajesh spun around, searching for an exit, but the doors at both ends of the carriage were gone. The windows, too, had vanished, replaced by smooth metal walls. He was trapped. As he backed into a corner, his hand brushed against one of the photographs on the wall. He recoiled, realizing the glass was warm to the touch. The figure in the photograph, one still, turned its head slowly to look directly at him, its mouth stretching into a scream. The other photographs followed suit, their frozen figures moving within their frames, their screams merging into a deafening cacophony. Rajesh clapped his hands over his ears, sinking to the floor as the train shuddered violently. Somewhere deep within its belly, the Midnight Express groaned like a living creature, its walls pulsing as if alive. And then silence. Rajesh opened his eyes, his heart pounding. The photographs were still again, their subjects staring blankly ahead. But now he noticed a new addition, his own face, captured mid-scream, staring back at him from a frame on the wall. The train began to move again, faster than before, hurtling toward an unseen destination. The train's speed increased, its wheels grinding against the tracks with a relentless, almost furious momentum. Rajesh clutched the edge of a seat to steady himself as the vibrations reverberated through the carriage. His reflection in the polished metal walls caught his attention, a pale, drawn figure that barely resembled him. Ahead, the door to the next compartment was ajar, its frame warped as if under immense pressure. Compelled by equal parts dread and desperation, Rajesh stepped forward. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a deep, rhythmic pulse that resonated from somewhere within the train, like a heartbeat. As he crossed into the next carriage, his breath caught. The interior was unlike anything he had seen before. The walls seemed alive, pulsating with faint crimson light that throbbed in time with the pulse. Vein-like patterns crisscrossed the floor and ceiling, and the air carried the metallic tang of blood. In the center of the compartment stood the conductor, his gaunt figure towering over a large, ancient-looking lever protruding from the floor. He turned slowly to face Rajesh, his hollow eyes glinting in the eerie light. "You're still here," the conductor said, his tone devoid of surprise. "Most don't make it this far." Rajesh swallowed hard. "What is this place? Where is this train taking me?" The conductor's expression twisted into a semblance of a smile. "The Midnight Express does not ferry the living. It is a vessel for the lost, the forsaken, and the damned." Rajesh stepped back instinctively. That's impossible. I'm alive. I'm not supposed to be here. The conductor's voice dropped, taking on an almost sympathetic tone. The living rarely recognize their fate. Denial is a powerful thing. I'm not dead, Rajesh shouted, his voice echoing through the carriage. I would remember if... The conductor raised a skeletal hand, silencing him. Would you? Death is often a quiet thing, creeping in unnoticed. Tell me, Rajesh, what was the last thing you remember before boarding this train? Rajesh hesitated, his mind racing. The day had been long, filled with meetings and travel, but the moments before he arrived at the station were hazy. He remembered walking through dark, empty streets, a distant whistle drawing him toward the station like a moth to flame. But before that, nothing. I was tired. I must have... His voice faltered. The conductor stepped closer, his hollow eyes piercing. Your journey began long before you stepped onto this train. You've been walking its path for longer than you realize. The compartment trembled violently, and the pulsing light intensified. Rajesh clutched at the wall, his thoughts unraveling. If I'm dead, he stammered, why am I here? Why this train? The conductor tilted his head, studying Rajesh as if weighing his soul. Some passengers are chosen. The reasons are rarely clear, even to us. But the destination is always the same. He gestured toward the far end of the compartment, where a set of heavy double doors loomed. Above them, a flickering sign read Terminus. The sight of the doors sent a wave of terror crashing over Rajesh. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. I'm not going through those doors, he said, his voice trembling. You have no choice, the conductor replied. Rajesh's desperation turned to defiance. No, I don't belong here. I'm leaving. The conductor sighed, a sound that echoed with ancient weariness. There is no escape, but if you insist on defiance, you may try the cabin. Perhaps you'll find the answers you seek there. Without waiting for clarification, Rajesh turned and bolted toward the front of the train. The carriages blurred together as he ran, each more decayed and twisted than the last. The air grew thicker, heavy with the stench of rot and decay. Finally, he reached the engine room. The door creaked open, revealing a space that seemed impossibly vast. The controls were minimal, just a single lever and a glowing console, but the room was dominated by a massive window that stretched across the front. Rajesh approached the window cautiously, peering out into the void. There were no tracks, no stars, nothing but an endless, swirling darkness. His gaze fell to the console, where a series of dials spun erratically. Strange symbols flickered across the screen, incomprehensible but oddly familiar. The lever gleamed untouched and waiting. A voice echoed behind him. You think you can change your fate? Rajesh spun around to find the conductor standing in the doorway. This train has no driver, the conductor said, stepping closer. It runs on the will of those aboard, but to seize control is to accept the truth you've been avoiding. Rajesh's eyes darted back to the lever. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his mind screaming against the unknown. Stop, the conductor bellowed, his voice reverberating through the room. Once you touch that lever, there is no turning back. But Rajesh didn't hesitate. His hand closed around the lever and pulled. The train lurched violently, and the darkness outside the window began to shift. Shadows writhed and coalesced, forming shapes too horrific to comprehend. Screams filled the air, a chorus of agony and despair that seemed to come from the very fabric of the train. The conductor's form began to dissolve, his features twisting and disintegrating into ash. You've made your choice, he rasped, his voice fading. The train began to slow, its furious pace reducing to a crawl. The darkness outside parted, revealing a vast, barren landscape. Towering spires of jagged rock jutted from the ground, and rivers of molten fire snaked through the desolation. Rajesh stared in horror as the train rolled to a stop at a platform marked Final Judgment. The door slid open, revealing a robed figure waiting on the platform. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated authority. It gestured for Rajesh to step forward. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I won't go." But the train itself seemed to reject him. Invisible hands pushed him forward, carrying him to the platform. The doors shut behind him, and the Midnight Express vanished into the void. Rajesh turned to face the figure, his heart pounding. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure raised a hand, and the barren landscape began to dissolve into light. Rajesh felt himself falling, his body unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. And then there was nothing.